Hi, everyone. Professor Sackett-Taylor here again. This is the second video in a series on Chapter 6 on the content of price controls from Principles of Microeconomics. In the first video in this series, we talked about price ceilings, and we looked at the example of rent control policies in major cities. In the second half of this lecture, we're going to talk about price floors, and the example we'll talk about are minimum wage laws. And we'll follow up on this because this is a really hot topic right now, especially for your generation. And we'll be talking about that a lot more in class. So just like price ceilings, price floors are an attempt that the government makes to come in and regulate the market by specifically here setting a legal minimum. So it means that the government comes in and says you can buy and sell this good and service for no less than this amount. And so there are three different situations. There's, again, a non-binding situation, a binding situation, and what happens in the long run. So again, let's look at our graph here. You should start to feel really familiar with this. This is our supply and demand graph, quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. We've got an upward sloping red supply curve and a downward sloping blue demand curve. Equilibrium is labeled here at the point of intersection where supply is equal to demand, and this equilibrium has an associated price. Now, when we have a price floor, you can literally, think about the floor beneath you. Stomp a little bit here. This is like, you can't go through the floor, right? You hit a minimum or you hit the bottom and you can't go through. This is like a price floor. So here, if a price floor is set, say at $2, it means that any price below $2 is illegal. It's in the red zone. But any price above $2 is fair game. It's in the green zone. So if a price floor is set below the equilibrium price, this is non-binding. And it's non-binding because you can see that when the price floor is below equilibrium, equilibrium remains in the green zone, the go-ahead zone, right? And so we are naturally drawn towards equilibrium. It's actually where we function most efficiently. And so if we have a price floor set, a government policy set where the price floor is below the equilibrium, it doesn't actually change our behavior. We naturally want to go to equilibrium anyway, and we'll do that because it's in the green zone. It's perfectly legal to do so. So this is what's called a non-binding price floor. However, if that price floor is set above the equilibrium, remember it's a legal minimum, that means that everything below that price floor becomes illegal, red zone, including the equilibrium price. We are naturally drawn to equilibrium. That's where we would like to be. But what we see is that we actually can't operate in the red zone. We have to be in the green zone. So what will we do? Well, we'll set the price as low as legally possible, meaning exactly equal to the price floor. The problem with this is that at a price floor above equilibrium or a binding price floor, the quantity supplied off of the red supply curve is much bigger than the quantity demanded, meaning there's more available than what people actually want to pay for. This is what we call a surplus. And so when we have a binding price floor above the equilibrium price, this will create a surplus for this good or service. Now, the thing that happens is oftentimes black market activity steps in to deal with this. And so what we find is that in this market where the price is really too high, it's above the equilibrium price, the sellers in that market will want to meet demand, right? They want to get rid of this extra inventory, all the product they can't sell. And so they'll drop the black market price all the way down here. And it's black market here because it's illegal, it's in the red zone, but they'll drop the market price down to the point on the demand curve that meets the supply that they have available. That's their only way they can actually get rid of this excess inventory is through black market activity. In the long run, it shouldn't surprise you when I tell you that everything is more elastic in the long run, it applies here too. So that supply curve and that demand curve will get flatter, and it will make that surplus bigger in the long run, right? It really spreads those points out. So time is not on our side with price controls. In general, both price ceilings and price floors have larger and more deeply felt outcomes the longer they're in place. So the example we're going to talk about here is the minimum wage. I wanted to give you a little bit of context for this, because this is something that you really should know a lot about. Many of you, I'm sure, as I have worked minimum wage jobs, or may have friends and family working minimum wage jobs. In fact, 9 out of 10 people working a minimum wage job are people with who are adults, not teenagers, and who have some form of education. So it's a large portion of our workforce. The minimum wage is set there's a federal minimum wage set by the United States government that has to be upheld in all 50 states. And then there's a state minimum wage, which cannot undo the federal minimum wage. So state minimum wages are often set above the federal minimum wage to add extra pressure or additional requirements for employers in that state. Right now, the federal minimum wage sits at $7.25 per hour. Massachusetts happens to be one of the 20-something states that has a higher statewide minimum wage. In the state of Massachusetts in 2021, the minimum wage was $13.50 per hour. The rationale for the minimum wage is that, people deserve, if they're working full-time, they're working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks per year, that work should, provide you at least with the basic necessities: food, housing, healthcare, clothing, right? Childcare, those kind of things should be able to be covered if you're working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. This is the idea behind a living wage, that based on the price or the cost of living, a minimum wage should be exactly that. It should be enough to cover all the basic expenses of living where you live. So this is what the idea behind a living wage. It's really to help the working poor, who are often less skilled, have less education or less experience, and help them maintain a living standard that is above the poverty line. Let's watch this short video to hear a history of the minimum wage.
It's not that young people aren't working, it's that they're not getting paid. How did we get to a point in America where you can work a full-time job, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, yet still be in poverty? Let's go back to the beginning. In 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt established the minimum wage of 25 cents per hour under this simple premise: pay your workers enough so they can afford the basic necessities of life. But the true impact of the minimum wage is measured through its purchasing power. Since the beginning, its purchasing power has fluctuated because the minimum wage has never been tied to inflation. For most of the 50s and 60s, an influential middle class helped create bipartisan support for minimum wage increases, which kept a family of 3 above the poverty line. In 1966, Congress extended the minimum wage to tipped workers like waiters and valets. The minimum wage hit its peak in 1968 when it was $1.60 per hour, which is today's equivalent to $10.75. But in the 1970s, inflation was high in the US, and the minimum wage increases barely kept pace with rising costs. When conservative economics became popular with President Ronald Reagan's election in 1980, the consensus was that markets, not the government, should dictate wages, and that artificially raising pay would hurt the economy by limiting job growth. As a result, there was no raise throughout Reagan's 8 years in office. With continuing inflation, the purchasing power of the minimum wage plummeted. Even in 1996, under President Clinton, when the minimum wage was raised from $4.25 to $5.15, restaurant owners successfully lobbied to prevent raises to the tipped minimum wage for workers. Since then, the tipped wage has been frozen at $2.13. Today, the federal minimum wage is only $7.25 per hour, far lower in purchasing power than in the 1960s. If you work 40 hours per week, 52 weeks per year at the minimum wage, your annual income is only $15,080. For a family of just two, that is below the federal poverty line. So, how do we change our economy to serve young American workers? It's up to you to vote for it. It's not.
So before we can talk about minimum wage, we really have to set up the model for the labor market. And this is new. So mostly what we've been talking about when we've been setting up the supply and demand diagram is we've been looking at the markets for goods and services, right? Things that you buy and sell. And in that market, the household or the individual like you or me is the consumer, and we demand goods. And the firm or the business is the producer or the supplier of goods. In the labor market, those roles are reversed because labor is not a good or a service. Labor is an input to production. So now we're looking at the market for factors of production, and households, individuals like you and me, we're the producers of labor. We supply the labor to the market, and the businesses, those big firms, they're the consumers of labor. They must buy our labor from us, making them the demand side of the market. So demand for labor is downward sloping, right? As wages go up, the businesses will want to hire fewer workers. And supply is upward sloping. As wages go up, more people will want to work. So when we look at minimum wages, it's assumed here that, let's just start, I wish there were only short run. Let's just start looking at the short run. So DSR is the short run demand, and SSR is the short run supply. Now remember, demand for labor are the employers, the businesses. They demand labor from us. And we, the households, the individuals, we're the red line, the supply of labor. Okay, so just like in any other market, we have quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. But here we have a word for the price of labor. It's the hourly wage. And so just like every other market, the labor market has an equilibrium where demand for labor is equal to supply of labor. Or in other words, in equilibrium, we have full employment. There's a wage, an equilibrium wage associated with that. Now, pay no attention to the actual numerical amounts here, because it's not really true in our context. But know that there is a wage that would give us essentially full employment. Now, if the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium, this is a price floor. Remember, you cannot go below it. So everything below the minimum wage is red zone, illegal. So a binding minimum wage would be set above the equilibrium wage. Now, that binding minimum wage, if set above the equilibrium wage, would result in a situation where the amount of labor supplied, given by the point on the red curve, is much bigger than the amount of labor demanded on the blue curve. So labor supply are people looking for work. Labor demand are the jobs available. When we have a binding minimum wage above the equilibrium, this creates a surplus in this market where there's greater labor supply than there is labor demand. In other words, there's more people looking for work than there are jobs available. We call this unemployment. And so oftentimes, conservative economists will make an argument against raising the minimum wage because their thought is that if we raise the minimum wage, that minimum wage will become binding and it will be above equilibrium, which theoretically, based on this model, could create some unemployment. As wages go up, the people will, want to work more, but also as wages go up, the businesses will want to hire less. And that's a reasonable argument, but you have to be thinking about where wages actually sit right now. Are wages currently above or below what would be a natural equilibrium? So with a minimum wage, unemployment can be created. It's created because the higher the wage, we're going to decrease demand for labor, or decrease the amount of jobs available, or maybe not amount of jobs available, but number of hours available even in those jobs. And at the same time, there's going to be more people looking for work. But also, as labor becomes more expensive, oftentimes labor is seen as substitutable with capital. In other words, jobs that people used to do, we can just replace them with machines. Think about the last time you went into a grocery store and how many different lanes there are to check out. Usually only one or two of those lanes actually has a person at it and is open. The rest are empty and you can't even go through them because most people are now going through the self-checkout line where we've replaced those people with machines. So people may also not only it might not be jobs get eliminated, but that the hours available within a job get shortened. All of these things can cause some level of unemployment as a result of a binding minimum wage. However, proponents of a minimum wage do advocate that with a minimum wage should come training, education, and other job allocation programs to help people find other work when they're offset by higher wages. All of this to be said that this requires a binding minimum wage, meaning that the minimum wage is actually above equilibrium. Right now, there's an argument being made by many politicians that we should be raising the federal minimum wage to keep up with inflation. That would mean that the federal minimum wage should be at least $10.25, but many are proposing a $15 federal minimum wage. In fact, the state of Massachusetts, it's on its way to a $15 minimum wage. So why are we proposing such a hike in the minimum wage if we know it can cause unemployment? Well, one of the answers here is that perhaps by right now, the minimum wage is actually below the equilibrium. If we're already below the equilibrium, raising the minimum wage might move us towards equilibrium and might not create the unemployment that we expect. Here's an example where the old minimum wage of $7 is down below. And what a low minimum wage creates is actually a labor shortage. Because in this case, when the minimum wage is below equilibrium, the amount of labor that is demanded by employers is much higher than the number of people actually willing to work for that wage. That's what we're seeing happen right now in our own time, that many people are not willing to put in the time, the effort, the energy that's being asked of them in jobs that pay such low wages. By raising the minimum wage, we might actually move ourselves towards equilibrium, reducing the size of that labor shortage. It's a big deal right now. We knew that a lot of jobs were lost during the pandemic, but now as we're starting to enter into post-pandemic recovery mode, we're actually not seeing people return to work at the rates that we might have expected them to. There are a lot of reasons for this. There are new COVID variants that are keeping people really attentive to their risk. There are a lot of people who, because of the time that they took off during the pandemic, realized they actually didn't want to keep working and went into early retirement. There are a lot of people who are still strapped with either childcare or elderly care responsibilities and can't go back into the workforce in the same way that they used to. A lot of people built up savings during the pandemic and may be living off of that money rather than rushing back into a job. But one of the main drivers is certainly that wages are very low. I would argue that the fact that we're in a labor shortage is an indicator that the wage right now is below the equilibrium, that we're living down here where demand for labor exceeds the amount of labor available, meaning a lot of minimum wage jobs, they're all hiring. If you walk through downtown areas, almost every window has a "we're hiring" sign, yet there aren't the workers looking and applying for those jobs, right? This is labor shortage. This is an indicator that that wage is too low. Let's watch this short video about our current labor shortage.
The U.S. unemployment rate hit a record high of 14.8% in April of 2020 during the height of the pandemic. Now, the most recent jobs report shows unemployment at 4.6% for October, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, those numbers tell a story of improvement, but the headlines and what you have likely felt as a consumer are a different story. Inflation is at a 30-year high. A record number of Americans are leaving their jobs, and supply chain issues have impacted nearly every corner of our economy. This week, we kick off our in-depth look at the local labor crisis with why this is happening and if it will get any better.
I think people thought a lot about during COVID is the work-life balance aspect, which is, do I want to work 60 hours a week? Do I want to commute an hour and back? And that's an hour out of their life in the morning.
And for millions of Americans, that answer is no. According to the turnover summary from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, a record 4.3 million people quit their jobs in August. It's something Webster University human resource professor Julie Palmer talks about a lot with her students.
So you think all these people realized all of a sudden that I'm not happy?
I don't think they realized it that quickly. I think it came over time. I think it came over the time of the pandemic where people were spending more time with their family or were having to make sacrifices. And then now they're trying to figure out whether or not they want to continue to make those sacrifices or if they think that they can obtain a better job and have a higher quality of life.
And we're feeling the ripple effects of the labor shortages, from the supply chain issues to inflation that's hit its highest level in decades.
So we don't have the truck drivers. We don't have the people that are working in construction. And so when economics says when you don't have the labor, prices are going to go up.
Gas prices are up 50%, used cars and trucks up 26%, and beef prices up 20%.
And that I don't believe we're in a state of panic yet, but I do think unless something turns, then we may be. I think if companies offer better wages and better benefits, we could see something turn.
Do you think that's what's going to take? What it's going to take?
Definitely.
Palmer compared what's happening now to the labor shortage during World War II, when millions of women joined the workforce to stabilize the economy. Well, now you see places lowering the age requirement to try and fill positions, but Palmer says there simply aren't enough teenagers to fill the void, and that this is our new normal. Coming up on our next half hour, MoDOT and IDOT are in need of.
All right, so that was a news article that came out just this last month in October of 2021 about our current labor shortages.
The U.S.
So what we know is that prices in any market, whether it be the market for goods and services or the market for labor, they act as signals. They give us information as consumers and producers that help us make decisions. But price controls distort those signals, right? They sometimes are misleading. They tell us something that isn't exactly equal to the value of that good or service, and can create artificial surpluses or artificial shortages by imposing policies that make the equilibrium actually illegal in the red zone. So these price controls are often put in place to help, in society. We have a responsibility to one another in our communities to act not solely out of efficiency, but also out of equity. But sometimes these price controls can lead to unintended consequences if you're not using them correctly. In the case of a minimum wage here, we saw that if a minimum wage is raised too high, that is above equilibrium, it becomes binding and can create labor surplus, unemployment. But that's not the situation we're seeing right now. Right now, wages are too low. They're below equilibrium, and it's resulting in a labor shortage. By raising the minimum wage, we could move that price closer towards equilibrium, moving us into a place where we have overall better employment numbers, and we're going to be matching employers with employees who are seeking the same kind of skills. So we're going to talk a lot more about minimum wage in class, and I'll see you then.